Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of We'll Do It Live with Meg Hansen. I'm here every day on Facebook from 6 p.m. to 6:30 p.m., live streaming, answering the questions you send me, and discussing topics related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Every aspect of it, whether it's public health and safety, economics, the politics of it, along with other current affairs that are relevant to Vermont. The idea is to maintain a connection, to use my healthcare experience and medical education as a sort of a starting point, a foundation to answer your questions, share important information, and well-researched and well-reasoned analysis. So with that, let's get started with today's topic. And this is part, as I said, it's a political aspect of the pandemic. It is something that is developing and not directly related to public health and safety or the economy, as our topics in the past have been. But this is a very important topic, and that is how we need to prioritize election integrity, maintaining it, protecting it, saving it in 2020. So, the very first thing that I will like to start off by saying is that election integrity, protecting it, is the civil rights issue of our time. Now, people love to talk about civil rights issue, especially on the left, and how every new ideological project is a civil rights fight. But this one really is. Why? Because, well, as a U.S. citizen, as an American, you cast your vote for someone, you write a check, right, to a political candidate, you engage in that process. Well, when non-citizens vote, that cancels your voice as an American. Is that fair? Not at all. Absolutely not at all. Every other nation requires citizenships verification. Every other nation prioritizes the fact that citizens need to be the ones who vote. So why should the United States then fall back? This is really, really important. I can't think of any reason why any American would oppose voter ID and citizenship verification. And yet, there are so many states, including Vermont, that do not require voter ID. Now, their idea, the claim, and this is from the left. This claim, that's why I said it's a political issue, because it comes from the left. They say that it is racist to require voter ID because certain demographics, certain populations, whether they're African American or Hispanic, are somehow unable to acquire voter ID. And so this is an obstacle. Requiring voter ID is an obstacle to vote, to exercise your right to vote. Okay, well, I just filed my taxes, our family taxes, for my husband and myself, federal and state taxes. And when I had to do that, I had to provide proof that I am who I am. I had to submit verification of my identification, mine and my husband. That's the only way we were able to then e-file our federal and state taxes. Is that racist? No, we can look over and over again where you always need an ID in order to survive in the United States, in order to live normal life. You obviously need voter ID. But when it comes to voting, which is so important because it determines who will lead the nation, who will set the policies for individual states and at the federal level, when it comes to that most critical right, for some reason, it's free for all, open for all. That's why I think it's very, very important for us as a number one civil rights issue. However, right now, under the excuse of the pandemic, we are seeing a push to subvert this issue furthermore. Now, in the United States, we have absentee voting, which means that if you're not able to go in person, you can mail in your ballot. Now, I'm going to look at an article that was recently published in the Wall Street Journal, and the title is Heed Jimmy Carter on the Danger of Mail-in Voting. And I'm going to go through this and talk about, in general, what's the problem what are the issues that we face, and then now with the pandemic, what are the dangers that are looming, and how we can prepare and prevent it from happening. So this article is written by John Lott. He's a president of the Crime Prevention Center, and this is how he starts off. He says, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. This quote is not from President Trump, who has criticized mail-in voting after the Wisconsin Democrats tried and failed to change an election at the last minute to make it an exclusively mail-in affair. No, this is the conclusion. What is the statement? Absentee ballots are the largest source of potential voter fraud. This is the conclusion of the bipartisan 2005 report of the Commission on Federal Election Reform, which was chaired by former President Jimmy Carter. So as we see on average, when we have just normal elections, no pandemic, the greatest source of voter fraud comes from mailing in voting. We have already seen that. Why? Well, because there's no way to verify. I mean, who's voting? Are you voting twice? Are you going to vote before and come again? Are you forging names? There's no notarized witnesses to say, oh, yes, this person is an American citizen, has never voted before and is voting now. There could be intimidation and bullying where someone's forcing you to vote a certain way. I mean, there's vote buying. There's so many ways in which you can absolutely negate that particular election by, tipping the scale into one side with all these illegal and criminal activities. So we've already seen that happen. Many countries, in fact, actually don't allow their citizens to mail in votes if they are present in the country. So Norway, which everybody loves to quote, right, especially Bernie Sanders, always looking to Scandinavia as the prime model example for a model society. Well, Norway, for example, does not allow citizens to mail in absentee ballots if you're actually present in the country. Same goes for Mexico. Many countries just don't allow that. We do. We recognize that, sometimes you can't go in and you can't vote, and there are reasons for that. But we have to be mindful because we have to take protective measures to make sure fraud doesn't happen. All right, this is normally. Now what is happening in Vermont? Well, Jim Condos, is the Vermont Secretary of State, and he published a commentary, the title of which reads, quote, our 2020 elections will rely on a significant increase in mail-in voting. That is so scary, so completely scary. We can't let that happen. Why would you decide now that August and November would be scenarios where people can't go and vote in person, and therefore we need massive mail-in voting? No, I mean, this is terrifying, and that's why I really want to highlight the issue and push it forward. So this is what he says, quote, there is no doubt in my mind that our 2020 elections will rely on a significant increase in by mail-in voting, end quote. There is a push from Jim Condos, by the way, is a progressive, and he also runs on the Democratic nomination. So he's very clearly on the far left. And there's been a real push to increase voter turnout, which is fine as long as it's a U.S. citizen voting once, because I really believe, and I'm all for this, every living American citizen deserves the right to vote and should be able to vote without impediment. No obstacles, no unnecessary complications, no voter suppression or any of that. I believe in that absolutely. But you vote once, and you only vote if you're an American citizen, and you can prove that. That's why I am for voter ID and citizenship verification. There are a lot of legal aliens who live in the U.S. They're here legally, but they're not citizens, and so they cannot vote. And this applies for permanent residents who have green cards are known as green card holders. They have the right to live in the United States forever. They're permanent, legal U.S. residents, but they are not citizens. So if you're not a citizen, you cannot vote. That is a right that is only for natural born and naturalized American citizens. And I am completely, aggressively protective of this particular right. And I'll say it over and over again. I think there's absolutely nothing racist about wanting to preserve the sovereignty of a nation. And that starts by making it clear that only if you have a right to vote can you do it. And for that, you need to be a citizen. So my question is, and this is to Jim Condos and to the Vermont Elections Division, who the director of which is a person called Will Senning. This is my question to them and to the rest of that division. Okay, let's say this widespread mail-in ballot effort is undertaken. Will you require voter ID? Because normally you don't, but now since you're changing the nature of our elections, or at least you want to, are you also going to protect the integrity by requiring voter ID? Are you going to require citizenship verification? How will the state ensure that every citizen votes only once? What are the steps that you are going to implement? What measures can we depend on to ensure that, okay, we have, widespread mail-in voting, but it's absolutely fair and clear and legal? How do we know that? Okay, my next question is, how will the state ensure that voters who vote from home are not being coerced or compelled to vote a certain way? Again, we need to demand these answers, because we need to know that if you're going to change our elections completely, fundamentally, and radically, then what protective measures are going to be put into place to ensure that the results are fair, the results are legal, the results are valid, and that we can actually respect and abide by the outcome. Finally, how will the state ensure that vote buying doesn't take place? Vote buying and voter fraud. Apparently, this was a practice in the United States before the secret ballot initiative was implemented. So that Wall Street Journal article that I refer to right now describes how there would be, there would be efforts where people would do sort of vote counting, and they would try to sway the election. They would recruit different people to go in different places and vote. There were all these kinds of measures that criminal measures that were actually quite rampant. And then a lot of reform was put into place. One of them was secret ballot. One of them was encouraging more in-person voting and having more places where you can actually go and vote, and then saying, hey, you should come and actually vote. So there were reforms that have been done. This actually began over 100 years ago, and it's really helped a lot of cases. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a throwback and fall back in that. And using the excuse of the pandemic is just a perfect way to really steal an election. That's my that's why I said I'm terrified about it, because how would I know that? How would any one of us know that the outcome is actually something to respect? Now, someone's going to say, or some people might say, well, Meg, you are feeling very passionate about this issue and you're very concerned about it because you're a candidate, because you're a statewide candidate, and so this is your life on the line. Sure, of course. I mean, I'm running. I've decided that I'm going to put my my time, my energy, my effort, myself out there in the arena, and I'm willing to fight. But I need it to be a fair fight. I think that's absolutely normal for me to want, for me to expect, and for me to call out people who I think are compromising the integrity of this particular race. Absolutely. But that's not my number one priority. My number one priority is to ensure that our politicians don't use this pandemic as an excuse to push in their agenda to fundamentally change the nature of the way our democracy works, the way our constitutional republic has maintained itself for decades, for centuries. That's my concern. My concern is first and foremost as a U.S. citizen, as a Vermonter. That's my concern. And that's why over and over I've said that we need to be really mindful. We need to really watch our leaders and see who is using this particular crisis to hoard power, to increase their voice by taking, accumulating a lot of um, duties or a lot of responsibilities, a lot of rights. Who is kind of using their executive power or legislative power to change the nature of that, versus who is opening up the system and allowing, a more democratization of voices and of power and of influence. That is something that we need to constantly look. I read an article about, which is really interesting. They called how there's a mushrooming of petty tyrants all over the nation. One of them is the governor of Michigan, who's decided that, she's the queen and she's going to not allow Michiganders to travel between their two homes. Like if you have two properties, you can't actually travel between your home in the city to your cabin up in the north part of the state. So that there is a mushrooming of that, and that's very interesting. So we should also be very mindful, very careful about what are our leaders saying? What do they actually want? And for me, Jim Condos, who is actually running for re-election, for me, his declaration that no matter what happens, we are going to have a significant increase in mail-in voting for August and November 2020. The declaration done now, in early April, that's a petty tyrant right there. And it's not just about, exercising his power. He's changing the way he and the election division is changing the way that our state is going to decide our new leaders in 2020, moving forward. Maybe this is going to be a permanent change. I don't know. Maybe massive mail-in voting without any kind of voter ID or citizenship verification is the new normal for Vermont. And that is extremely scary, because it means that it's not a fair and free election anymore. And so why I'm really bothered, maybe you can sort of sense, a real sort of emotional, response here from me, is because this is so wrong. This is so wrong that I have a real visceral response to it, and I obviously don't want to be ranting and raving, and I'm trying to contain it and sort of discuss it in a rational way. But what really bothers me is when people use a certain reason to push their tyranny and say that they're protecting it. So Jim Condos right off the bat starts off by saying that holding fair, free, and accessible elections is, while protecting public health during this time of social distancing, is absolutely important, is the most important priority. So he's saying we need to have fair and free elections, and that's why we need to do all these things. But the fact of the matter is, by making all these changes, he and his ilk are ensuring that the elections are not free, they're not fair, and that they're rigged to support, their agenda. And so this brings me to my next point about a false choice that he and others, not just in Vermont, but across the nation, are putting up. And we need to not just refute it or debunk it or call it out. We need to destroy it. That's the thing. We need to forcefully destroy this false choice that they are putting up, that they're setting up between what? Between exercising your right to vote on the one hand and protecting your health and public health and safety against COVID-19 on the other hand. So they're trying to say, the Wisconsin Democrats did that for the primary. He talks about it too in his article, Jim Condos. And what they're saying is, well, you shouldn't have to choose between exercising your right to vote and also putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to COVID-19. So just stay at home and we'll mail you the ballots, and then you can just, do it in the privacy and safety of your home. And that way you get to vote and also not fall ill. This is wrong. This is false. There is absolutely no reason to expect that in August or in November, it's going to be like, some kind of war situation out there that you can't step out and that you can't go and vote. We're allowed to go to the grocery store, right? The same grocery store where all of us congregate. We're all buying and shopping together over there. If we can go and buy groceries in March and April, then we can absolutely go and vote in August and certainly in November. So this is an absolutely false choice and needs to be destroyed. It needs to be called out and ended right away. It just needs to be done that. Now, there's not a lot of power that people like me, people who share these opinions have. And so I'm afraid that we might end up, going the way that the progressives and the Democrats want, which is a massive, a large-scale mail-in voting that is obviously, it's going to be rife with all kinds of fraud. So how do we protect ourselves? Well, we need to demand voter ID, citizenship verification, and the questions that I asked earlier. We need to reiterate and emphasize that over and over again. What are the tangible steps, the measures that Jim Condos and the Vermont state government are implementing to ensure that every citizen votes only once, that there is no intimidation, that there is no vote buying, and there's no fraud? What are the actual steps that you're going to enact? We need answers, and we need to constantly demand that. And finally, another aspect is that the ballots, is the voter sheets not the ballots, the voter sheets, the rolls basically are dirty. They need to be cleaned up. And there is an expectation that the state government needs to take certain reasonable steps to ensure that the names are actually active and living voters, citizens. So many people move, people die, and they're known as inactive voters, and they're still on the ballot. Right? Is that what is called the ballot? Why am I saying that again and again? So I guess the voter sheets. There needs to be steps made to clean it, as they call it, and make sure that they're not dirty. Judicial Watch is a nationwide organization that's been focused on various states that have very, as they call it, very dirty voter sheets. And so when they began that process, overall in the nation, there were more than 3 million voters whose names were still there, who apparently voted, but they're inactive because they either died or they moved, they weren't in that particular state anymore. Since they began this process, there are 2 million now. And we all need to look at Vermont specifically. I'm going to do some research to see what exactly is, if it's available, what is the data on Vermont? I mean, how many people are actually alive and active and live in the place that they say that they do and vote, as opposed to deceased persons, as opposed to people who are no longer Vermonters still apparently voting. So that kind of stuff, that kind of sort of again, it's fraud, right? That's going to be even more now that when we, if they undertake, which I'm afraid they might, massive significant, increase in mail-in voting. I don't know. Are they going to get dirtier instead of cleaner? That's definitely a concern that I have to look at. So I'm sorry that it's it's sort of a kind of like a Debbie Downer episode, but this is something that is really worrying me. It's really, really worrying me, and I don't know how it can be fair. I mean, so if they rig the elections in this way, how is it ever going to be possible for any kind of change to ever happen in Vermont? Any kind of new voice, any kind of disruption, any kind of change? I'm talking about a course correction. I'm talking about new voices, real solutions, a whole new way of looking at it. How can that ever happen if there is no process by which, no fair, free, legal, respectful process by which new voices can come in and reform the system? I mean, if you have this massive iron gate, which is, in the form of these very scary measures, blocking everyone else out, that will just ensure that the status quo right now continues in perpetuity. It just will always serve the particular system, and our only choice for those of us who love Vermont and want to see a new way forward, the only way would then be to leave, right? I mean, how can we actually do anything if we don't even have a voice, a chance to engage with the system? And so that brings me to my last point, which is sort of weird if you think about it. My question is, what's the difference between Bradley Cooper and Russell Crowe? So now, I'm not trying to trivialize this at all. I honestly believe that there are lessons to be learned from every aspect of society and culture if you want to. And I really like thinking about supposedly non-related things and applying lessons that I learned from one or the other. So I really like both these actors. As yesterday I talked about that I really like Russell Crowe. I also like Bradley Cooper. I think he's had a very interesting life story. But they're both very, very different. So Bradley Cooper, he's okay, his life story is that, well, he's from Philadelphia. He went to Georgetown University, just like my husband, for undergraduate school. Then he went to New York to the Actors Studio, and he got a master's degree in acting, which is kind of rare. Normally people don't do that and then, become superstars, but he did. He struggled. He, had bit roles in Sex and the City and all kinds of little things, and I think Alias. And then he worked hard and he made it. So he had the Hangover series, and then he did more serious roles with Limitless and American Sniper, and now most recently with Lady Gaga, the musical. So he's had a very interesting career. He's won a lot of awards. Oh, also Silver Linings Playbook. He's had many, he's an Oscar nominated, celebrated actor. But if you look at his life story and you look at his personality and who he is, he's very different from Russell Crowe, who, as I talked about yesterday, he comes from a working class New Zealand and Australian background, really not privileged at all, and he's not an American, but he won Oscars and he made it in Hollywood. So that journey from New Zealand and Australia all the way to America is different. I'm not trying to say that it's worse or better than that of Bradley Cooper's, but they're very different, okay, right? And so I was trying to think, okay, superficially, these are all the differences between them. But what's the real difference? I've watched their interviews and I've thought about it. So they're very different. They come across and they seem very different. They're very talented and they've worked hard and have a good career, but they're very different. And what's that difference? So the difference for me is that Bradley Cooper plays the game and Russell Crowe does not. That's the difference. So what do I mean by that? Well, when Bradley Cooper was, doing well and in the limelight, he did everything that is expected of a movie star. He went on Ellen, he cracks jokes, he goes on late night shows, he's buddy with all the right people. When he did American Sniper, and people on the right thought that he's a Republican because they sort of, projected Kyle onto Bradley, and they thought that he's actually a Republican. Well, then Bradley Cooper made sure that he was seen at the Democratic Party convention, that he gave money to Barack Obama and other Democratic Party leaders, that he completely immediately quelled any kind of talk that he was a Republican. He always makes sure that he's seen with the right people doing the right things that is expected in Hollywood. I don't know what he really feels, but he always plays the game in that way. Russell Crowe, on the other hand, refused to do that. So his peak came in the early 2000s, and both of them drink, by the way. Both of them are party boys. Both, Bradley Cooper did it so much that he had to then stop, and he gave up drinking. But so it's not like, one is like a goody two shoes and the other is not. Both of them were. But Russell Crowe was never politically correct, and he didn't care about it. And so he was termed Hollywood bad boy. He said that he hates that phrase because that's not true at all. But that's what he was labeled as. And they decided that you're not playing the game, and so we're going to reject you. And we're going to not give you an award, the Oscar award for A Beautiful Mind. I mean, that was not based on merit. That was completely politics, because he would get angry, he would speak his mind, he wouldn't go on Ellen and the late night shows, he wouldn't, go to their parties, he wouldn't do that. And so there's a real difference then, because merit is not valued then. It's about other things like popularity, fitting in, conforming. And so when I look at this particular issue with how they're changing elections, when I look at Vermont, and when I look at, here we are trying to make change. Here I am embarking on this statewide campaign, and I'm trying to make a difference, and I'm saying all these things. So the question is, I was thinking, the question, Meg, is the question, do you want to play the game or do you not want to play the game? Do you want to go the way of Bradley Cooper or Russell Crowe? And I think that's not correct. I've been thinking about it. I think the question isn't that, do you want to play the game? I don't think that's the right question. The right question is, how do you want to play the game? Because you have to play. If you want to make a difference, if you want to step into the arena, which I want to and I have, if you want to reform and you want to have that course correction, you've got to engage with the people who are already around, the players. You've got to play the game. But then how are you going to do it? That's the question. And that's what I'm trying to answer. So I want to do it on my own terms. I want to do it by defining my own rules and saying, no, I'm not going to kiss all the political rings. I saw a comment on Vermont Digger, which really stayed with me, one of the articles, about how there are politicians who really are really striving to kiss the right political rings, to stay relevant, to stay in power, to win and curry favor with all the elites in Montpelier. I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, but at the same time, I don't want to make the mistake that Russell Crowe did, which is allow other people to define me and then constantly have to keep fighting that. For him, it was Hollywood bad boy. For me, it is, right-wing ideologue or, far right, too conservative for Vermont. All those, there's so many different variations to that. I think that's the main one. I don't want to allow them to define me and then spend all my time trying to push that out and say, no, that's not who I am. No, I'm very clear about who I am. I know why I'm running, and I want there to be a course correction. I absolutely do. The reason why the theme of our campaign is small towns, big hearts is because I wanted first and foremost to define who we are. What do we stand for comes second. Who we are is first. And there's a distinction between the Burlington metropolitan area. Again, I don't mean any offense, or I'm not calling out anybody who's actually there. I'm talking about the leaders. I'm talking about the politics of the Burlington metropolitan area. That is what dominates Vermont, and it has brought us to this particular point where we're looking at things like completely fundamentally changing the nature of our elections and having no protective measures to ensure the integrity of our election. Absolutely subverting American citizenship, subverting our voices as American citizens. All these things come because the politics of that particular area completely monopolize that of the rest. And I fundamentally disagree. I vehemently disagree with that. The rest of Vermont is very much one of small towns, and I absolutely believe that Vermonters of all stripes have big hearts, and they are unfortunately not represented. They're not represented, and that's not okay. Which is why I'm so concerned. What's going to happen if they do mail-in voting? If they rig the elections and they steal it, what's going to happen to us? I mean, tomorrow there won't be other people even striving. There won't even be, voices stepping up and saying, "Hey, look, I want to make a difference." That won't even happen. That's why I'm a little emotional today, and I'm concerned. But I really hope that this can all become, obsolete, because there won't be a shutdown anymore. Things will clear up, and we can move forward. I'm just going to keep pressing on, and I hope that you will join me by demanding that our elections in 2020 and moving forward are absolutely preserved in terms of integrity. Absolutely preserved. That needs to be number one. Otherwise, I don't know what's going to happen to Vermont, and I'm very, very afraid of. I'm very afraid of that outcome. Okay, well, that's it for today. My email address, as I say all the time, is info@Hansen, Hansen for Vermont, spelled out.com. Please write me with your questions, your concerns. You can also write on Facebook. We are very active here on our campaign page. Please feel free to share all this content with other Vermonters who you think would appreciate this content and would, would like to also contribute. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again tomorrow at 6 p.m.